My name is Jamar. I come from afar. Allahu Akbar!
Do I have your guys' attention? Good. Because today's video is something a little more different than usual. Over the course of many months, I've been trying to find other shows to like and enjoy. But since Harvey Beaks was really the only one I could really enjoy, I struggled for many months to find a show or a franchise that I could get myself really invested in. It wasn't until June or July I began to find myself getting very invested in the Looney Tunes franchise. Slowly but surely, I found myself becoming a fan of Looney Tunes by August. And since I had seen all 3 movies by that point, it'd only be necessary to make a review/ranking on all 3 movies. Space Jam and Back in Action I had seen on DVD many years ago when I was a youngster, while A New Legacy I saw in theaters just about maybe a month, maybe 2 months ago. But anyway, I'm getting off track here. This is my personal rankings on each Looney Tunes movie. Before I start though, just a side note, some of these opinions may trigger some of you. Anyway, let's begin.
What's that? 3 bells! Well, we all know what 3 bells means.
Free ice cream!
No, you silly livers. No!
Oh boy, we're not off to a good start now, are we? Now before anybody decides to get hostile with me, just hear me out. I don't dislike Back in Action, but I'm just gonna put it in the nicest way possible and say that in my personal opinion, it is the weakest Looney Tunes movie. I understand if you guys find it the best Looney Tunes movie. I mean, kudos to you, but yeah, it didn't work for me. Case in point, the pacing in the movie is really weird. The human characters are very unmemorable, and the plot just kinda, well, exists. Don't get me wrong, I understand this movie went through production hell, and it has led me to have more sympathy for this movie, but even then my opinions haven't changed too much. But that doesn't mean there wasn't any good parts in the movie. There was one sequence, though, that really worked, and that was the Las Vegas sequence. Holy hell, what a kick-ass sequence. By far my favorite scene, and always has me at the edge of my seat. So great, in fact, that me and my brother at the time memorized almost the entire dialogue. And to add to that, the animation has aged like fine wine. If the rest of the sequences in Back in Action were just as good as the Las Vegas sequence, I probably would have given this movie a much higher rating. I'm sorry to any Back in Action fans, I want to enjoy this movie just as much as you guys do, but it just didn't work. As far as its troubled production history goes, I recommend looking it up and stuff. There's so much more to cover. Overall, Back in Action is a failed but earnest attempt at making a Looney Tunes movie.
I'm Hank Steele, the real queer cowboy, the gerbil-loving, where-winning cowboy. I'll grab your butt cheeks and...
Surprised, are ya? When I came out of the theater after watching it, I was surprised myself. I mean, the movie was okay-ish. Sure, it might be higher than Back in Action, but that's not really saying much. It's a really mixed bag, to be honest. It's got an equal amount of good and an equal amount of bad. Let's talk about the good to get it out of the way. 2D animation is absolutely fantastic. The tunes are better portrayed than they were in the original Space Jam. Lola Bunny's personality was improved amazingly. Gathering Up the Tunes was a real banger. It just seemed to have a lot of improvements and was pretty good for the first half of the movie. But once the CGI kicks in, it's a shit show from there. Now, let's talk about the negatives. The negatives include, but are not limited to, horrible CGI, predictable plot, terrible villain, severe cringe, generic and unmemorable soundtrack, bad acting, and much more I don't have time to explain. I think you get the picture. Whether you like the original Space Jam or not, in my personal opinion, I don't think A New Legacy was a good investment. If you ask me, the original should have just been left alone. Overall, Space Jam A New Legacy is just okay. It could have been better than the original, but obviously it wasn't. Not to mention how corporate this movie really was. It really lacked charm to what the original had, which leads me to number 1. You guys probably saw this coming, didn't you? Don't get me wrong, I completely see the many flaws of this movie. But I gotta be honest and say, out of all the Looney Tunes movies we got so far, this is undeniably the best of the 3. Keep in mind, I haven't seen this movie since late 2009. I was very young back then and barely remembered the movie, if anything about it at all. The only things I remembered about it was it just being really weird. Rewatching it earlier this year, though, changed those opinions very much. And now, while the movie hasn't particularly aged well, I can definitely see why people find this as a cult classic. It's just one of those movies you ain't supposed to take serious. And although the tunes may not be portrayed too great, at least they stay consistent throughout the film, for the most part. To be honest, this is actually my introduction to them. Even if I don't remember the film very well, this is the first time I really got to see the Looney Tunes. That said though, I was never really a fan of the Looney Tunes as a kid. It was always that one show or franchise that I watched because there was nothing else on TV. Rewatching Space Jam is what made me become a Looney Tunes fan and start watching this show once more, but actually caring for the franchise as a whole. And now on to the final verdict. Back in Action for the most part is boring and forgettable. A New Legacy is only good during the 2D segments. And the original is one hell of a guilty pleasure for me.